Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony, which today commemorates the 76th anniversary of the fall of Singapore. My name is Richard Cruz, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Corporal Jeanette McNeely. We warmly welcome the family of Private William Maxwell Ferguson, whose story will be told shortly. We are honoured to acknowledge His Excellency Mr Kwok Fook Singh, High Commissioner of Singapore to Australia, and the accompanying delegation. Mr David Ross, President of the 8th Division Association, and Mr Dennis Baker, President of the 2nd 20th Australian Infantry Battalion Association, and representatives of the 2nd 19th and 2nd 30th Australian Infantry Battalion Association. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by family, visitors and students on behalf of the following schools. From Queensland, John Paul College, Daisy Hill, and from New South Wales, Canberra School for Girls, Rose Bay. I'd now like to invite Dr. Brendan Nelson, Director of the Australian War Memorial, to deliver an address.
The most important year in our nation's history is 1788. The British First Fleet arrived, disrupting and devastating millennia of rich Aboriginal custodianship, history and culture. But from that event and all that would follow, the origins of the Australia we are and the people we have become. The next most important year was 1942, and the most important event in that year is that which we commemorate here today, 76 years later. The 8th Division was formed in July 1940. It had originally been intended to serve in Africa and the Middle East, but the Japanese, when they attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, simultaneously landed on the Malay Peninsula. And it was the 8th Division that largely stood with British and Allied forces between it and its principal objective of Singapore. 1,789 Australians of the 8th Division died in the defence of Singapore, 880 in the week leading up to its fall, 76 years ago today. 1,306 were wounded. Normally you would expect the wounded to be 3 times that of the dead, but such was the determined ferocity of the defence that was put by the Australians that they were the casualty rates that were recorded. And on this day, these fit young men that had fought so desperately for our nation and our interests in the defence of what the British had called Fortress Singapore. Fortress Singapore because it was thought it would never fall, stood in silent helplessness, bewildered as the Japanese victors took over Singapore. And on that day, 15,000 young Australians went into captivity, prisoners of war of the Japanese. 22,000 Australians in total over a 5-week period, prisoners of war. 15,000 in the island of Changi at Singapore. 1 in 3 would die in captivity. And of those who survived physically, they would return with a lifetime of deep sorrows, anguish and despair, escalated and exacerbated by the ambivalence of the Government of Australia in its reception to these prisoners that returned home. And today we honour one of those, we remember one of those, and we honour and remember them all. Just two, in particular, stories for the younger people here to reflect upon. Sergeant John Neville of the 2nd 10th Field Regiment said this at the capture: "The most lasting memory of the fall of Singapore was the terrific silence following the ceasefire order. The din of firing, bombs falling and exploding, and general noises of war had become normal to us. When it suddenly ceased, the silence seemed to hurt. One felt as though he were alone in a secluded forest glade, with all the bird sounds and noises muted. It had never entered my head there would be such thing as a surrender. I never thought about being a prisoner. On the previous Wednesday, we had all been told to fight to the last man. Such as discipline through long training does this to you, and long training we had during 12 months in Malaya before the action started. To hear that we had capitulated left us dumbfounded." And by way of description and revelation of the Australian character of those men who were imprisoned at Changi, the Australian commanding officer of these men of the 8th Division, the Australians at Changi, was a man called Lieutenant Colonel Jack Callaghan. They called him Black Jack. And he had impressed upon the Australians that even though they were prisoners of war, they were never to forget that they were Australians and they were Australian soldiers, no matter what would be visited upon them by their Japanese captors. Stan Arneil was one of those prisoners, and he described the men of the 2nd 30th Battalion returning to Changi, having been working on the Burma-Thai Railway. He said this: "It was a moonlit night, and Changi, with the tropical waters around the island, was so beautiful. I can still hear the squeal of brakes as the trucks lined up. The people from Changi knew we were coming, and they came over to see us, to look for old friends and see how we were. We got out of the trucks. A couple were dead, and we laid them on the ground, and we lined up on the road. We were not ashamed because we were soldiers, and we wanted to look like soldiers. The people from Changi stood back and uttered not a word. It was really quite strange. We lined up on the road as best we could and stood up as straight as we could. Those who couldn't stand up straight were on sticks, and those who couldn't stop shaking with malaria were held by their friends. We thought this was what we should do as soldiers, to say that we were not beaten. The Sergeant Major dressed us off, and we stood in a straight line as he went over and reported to Major Johnston. Johnston went over to Black Jack Callaghan, and he said, "Your 2nd 30th all present and correct, sir." The Major said, and Callaghan said, "Where are the rest?" The Major said, "They're all here, sir." And we were. Black Jack Callaghan, the Iron Man, broke down and cried. It was an incredible scene. We wanted to show them we were soldiers. To young Australians in particular, in the late 1990s, those men whom Parkin just described of the 2nd 30th published a book entitled Getting On With It. They wanted to pass to your generation what they had learned. And you know, there are two things that stood out. One of them who survived all of that, he said, "You might want to hate the Japanese for what they did. You might never be able to forget. But I can't hate another human being. I can't. I need to forgive. And it's the hardest test of all. But it's worth it, because I believe in myself and I value others." And another one said, "I suppose compassion means being prepared to listen to other people's point of view and respecting those.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. I would now like to invite members of the Sydney Women's Vocal Orchestra to sing the Captives' Hymn. The hymn was composed in Palembang Prison of War Camp in 1943 by the Presbyterian missionary Margaret Dryburgh and was sung by the women internees at every funeral held in the camp. Since the war, it's become an unofficial anthem for former prisoners of war and has been sung each year at the Fall of Singapore and the 8th Division commemorative service held in Martin Place in Sydney. The Sydney Women's Vocal Orchestra was formed to recreate the music sung in the camp, and today they will perform the hymn as a trio, as it was sung at its very first performance on the 5th of July, 1942. Thank you, ladies. Could I ask you to please stand and join in singing the national anthem? seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations over more than a century. But first we present a lament, flowers of the forest. Wreaths and floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Private William Maxwell Ferguson. William Ferguson was born on the 1st of November 1900 in the Sydney suburb of Woolloomooloo, the son of William and Catherine Ferguson. He worked as a publishing hand and in 1929 married Kathleen Peace Judd. At the time of his enlistment in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force in June 1940, he was living with his wife and 2 children in Dee Why, to the north of Sydney. Ferguson enlisted in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force in June 1940 and in late July joined the 2nd 20th Infantry Battalion. In early February 1941, Ferguson and his battalion moved from Bathurst to Darling Harbour, where they embarked on the transport ship Queen Mary, headed for Singapore. Ferguson was a keen musician. He had kept a violin at home and after joining the military, played baritone in his battalion's band. He would have entertained his fellow troops while on the long ocean crossing. The Australian War Memorial has in its collection a handkerchief signed and decorated by Ferguson and other members of the band, and it is likely that they decided to create this memento whilst on their voyage. Ferguson disembarked in Singapore on the 18th of February 1941 and almost immediately moved with the rest of his unit north to the Malayan Peninsula. Here, the 2nd 20th Battalion trained, adjusting to the hot and steamy tropical conditions and preparing extensive defences in the case of an attack. In January, parts of the 2nd 20th Battalion came under Japanese attack for the first time. Following heavy Japanese bombing at Mersing and a series of clashes to the north, the 2nd 20th withdrew and by the end of January were in Singapore. Here, Ferguson and his unit formed defences on the northwest coast of the island, hampered by a lack of materials, almost constant Japanese air attack and persistent rain. On the eve of the Japanese invasion, the 2nd 20th Battalion had a total strength of 750 men, with which to defend a sector that stretched over 7 kilometres. On the 8th of February, Japanese forces launched their main assault on Singapore. The 2nd 20th Battalion came under heavy artillery fire, followed by a large attack by Japanese ground troops and aircraft. The Japanese landing was concentrated on the northwest of Singapore, where the 2nd 20th was stationed. Despite desperate defence, the battalion was forced to withdraw, and in the chaos and confusion of battle, it was scattered over a wide area. Losses were heavy. In the first 12 hours of the attack alone, the 2nd 20th lost 400 men, killed and wounded. Like so many of his comrades, Private William Ferguson was originally reported as missing in action during the chaotic days of the fall of Singapore. His wife and children faced years of not knowing if he had been killed in action or taken prisoner. It wasn't until 1946 that Ferguson was officially declared to have been presumed killed in action. A later report stated that he and 2 other bandsmen went to collect an ammunition truck for some infantrymen and were never heard from again. William Ferguson was 41 years old. Today, his remains lie in the Kranji War Cemetery in Singapore, amongst nearly 4,500 Commonwealth casualties of the Second World War. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, among more than 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War. His photograph is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private William Maxwell Ferguson, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, We will remember them.
We will remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes this evening's last post ceremony. We thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.